hope this microphone works. I'll start. Ngadlu tampinthi yalaka tarrkarri-arra inparrinthi Kaurna Miyurna yaitya mathannya Wama Tartanyaki Ngadlu Kaurna Pukiana Miyurna puki-puki-nangku Kaurna Purkana yalaka tarrkarri-arra kuma tampinthi Kaurna miyurna-rlu parnaku yailtya tapa purruna kuma puru martinthi puru tanka martulyai-nthi, which is your generic acknowledgement of country. I'm Rachel. I'm going to talk today about cross-pollination in language reclamation methodology. Basically, when ideas for methodologies for language revival are developed in one community and then they're transported to another community and used there, what works and what doesn't, and why does or doesn't it work. So you might think indigenous minority language communities are pretty isolated. This is not actually the case, particularly with social media. Indigenous people worldwide keep in touch with what's going on in other areas. Two quick examples. The first one's from February this year. The Canadian government was putting a gas pipeline through the Wet'suwet'en country. This is a sign that went up on the Isle of Skye in Scotland in Gaelic, supporting the Wet'suwet'en. And the second one's from May. The Navajo were quite badly hit by coronavirus, and the people of Ireland raised $2 million to send them. And I did say social media, but it goes far back from that, because part of the reason the Irish people did that was because in 1840 the Navajo sent $170 to them as famine relief. So, you know, Indigenous communities talk to each other and on social media, and it often devolves into complaining about colonisation, which I'm sure is cathartic for people, but it's not exactly useful. But as Gillard says, language revitalisation fosters cooperation between communities which may be fighting about other issues. And I would go so far as to say it provides a common goal and a common ground for communities that may be so completely different they have nothing else in common. And it also helps, you know, say a small community of 100 people with 2 speakers who are wanting to revive their language don't have to invent everything for themselves. They can look at what other countries have done, what other language groups have done. But let's see, don't take it from me. This is Adrian Kane, the Manx Language Development Officer from the Isle of Man.
But we're also aware of the importance of what we do. We've been very lucky in the Isle of Man because of the renaissance in the language and the culture and the music, and associated with that and the work I'm involved in, to have a number of people come to the Isle of Man from similar language communities, Jersey, Guernsey, Sami communities, America, Canada, Australia, to find out about the work we do. And we hope some of the work we do can help them in the work they do. It's not peripheral. In fact, it's the story of reaching out to the world, sharing ideas. And we're aware that some of the stuff we do has been a consequence of what's happened in places like Hawaii, New Zealand, Scotland, etc. We're part of a global community. We're part of a global sort of...
So I'm going to look at 3 examples of language reclamation and language revival methodology that have, as I say, moved into different communities and looked at whether they've worked or not when they've moved. So we'll stay with the Isle of Man and look at language nests, which, you know, other people have already talked about. So as you know, they started in New Zealand. They're very successful there, very quickly went to other Polynesian countries. And then basically anywhere in the world there's a minority language, there's probably a language nest program at this point. Now, Onua McIver did a study in 2004 of language nest programs in British Columbia, and she said that it's easy to overthink them, but basically what you need is a fluent or a native speaker who is sort of sprightly enough to interact with toddlers. If all your speakers are a bit too old to manage a full day in a room with a bunch of 2-year-olds, then you need to look at, you know, part-time and so on. You need enough money to pay those people to do the work. You usually need someone who's qualified to teach, because no matter how lovely your elder is, the education authority of your country might not see it that way. And crucially, you need toddlers, and specifically toddlers who have parents who will support their language learning. So there are obvious benefits. The native speaker doesn't need to be a trained teacher. It's helpful, but it doesn't have to be. And also, if you get them young, you get native speakers. Some of the drawbacks include the immersion environment is difficult to maintain. Especially if you've got a native speaker who's spent the last 70 years of her life being told not to speak the language that you're now asking her to speak with toddlers. And again, McIver says that it's difficult when at pickup time, if you're maintaining the immersion environment and you've got to communicate with parents who don't speak the language that you're meant to be immersing the children in. And there needs to be support for the language afterwards or at home at school. So are there any unsuccess stories? And I'm saying yes. The Minjavega, which is the Language Nest program in the Isle of Man. I heard from Manx speakers that you do not get fluent Manx speaking children out of this. I have not been able to find any academic references for this, but their Minjavega website, how much Manx do staff have? Some of our staff are fluent speakers and others are learners committed to using Manx words. This is not an immersion environment. And so what went wrong there is that the last native speaker died in 1974. There was 30 years of no native speakers before they started the immersion kindies. And while they did have fluent speakers in that time, they didn't have enough of them to maintain the immersion environment. The other question on the website, what happens to Manx they know when they go to school? Knowledge of the language will not disappear but my late dormant. There is a Manx immersion school, but there's one on the island, so not all children who have gone to the immersion childcare centres are able to go to the immersion school. So the second method, Ulpan, which, as I'm sure you know, was developed in Israel in the 1940s. And it was based on language teaching methods in the US Army at that time. And basically where it differs from most language teaching at that time was very rote grammar based. And Ulpan emphasizes teaching vocabulary and phrases which you need in order to integrate into the community. It assumes you're an adult trying to integrate into a community where this language is spoken. It was then adopted into Wales in the 90s and then Scotland and Norway in about 2010, 2012. So yeah, the obvious benefits include you get a lot of stuff in a short time frame, you're teaching adults to speak the language, you can implement it on a large scale. But the one requirement is it assumes that you're speaking the language outside the classroom or that you'll have opportunity to use the language outside the classroom. So it was successful in Israel. It was and is still successful in Wales. So naturally Scotland thought, if it works in Israel, it works in Wales, we're culturally the same as Wales, or similar. It didn't work in Scotland. And this is because it's run in Wales by Bangor University, which is in Gwynedd, a bit of Wales where Welsh is still the first language and the language of the street. It's the language of the education system there. And it's pretty much the only place in the British Isles where people speak the native language as their first language, but their English language skills are much worse than the indigenous language. Whereas in Scotland, it's usually run in cities, which are not places where Gaelic is spoken as a community language. And even when it is run on the islands, there's an issue there with, and there was a study published this year by a number of people with long Irish names, saying that within 10 years there will no longer be anywhere where it is the language of the community. So the Isle of Lewis, Ulpan's run there, has 70% Gaelic speaking. It's the highest percentage of anywhere in the world. But that's 30% of the people in the community who don't speak Gaelic. And if you're a shopkeeper from the Isle of Lewis and someone comes into your shop and you don't recognise them, you don't know if they're here for language immersion or if they're a tourist from England. So you're not going to be speaking Gaelic to the person. So if you're doing the Ulpan course, you're not hearing it, you're not using the phrases, which the course assumes you will be. And the third program is the master-apprentice program, which again has been used in a lot of places, and I'm going to focus on one community in the US and one community in Canada because the ones I know about. So I'll have another quick video to see if you can begin seeing some of the benefits that this program might bring. This is a speaker of Wakchamni in the US.
Seems weird that I am the last one. And I don't know, it'll just be gone one of these days, maybe, I don't know. It might go on and on.
I think she has a... So basically a master-apprentice program takes a fluent speaker, usually an older speaker from the community. In the case of Marie there, she was the last speaker of her language. And it pairs them with a sort of intermediate to proficient learner who has the time to spend with this elder and learn the language deeply and learn the cultural knowledge deeply. And so this has obvious benefits. Your native speaker, it meets them where they are. They're an old person doing what they know, which in the case of old people is usually talking a lot. And it gives you a deep cultural knowledge and intergenerational connection, which is something that can be lacking from classroom language learning. As you saw there with Marie, she was sad thinking that she was the last speaker, and then she lit up when she was speaking in Wakchamni to her apprentice. So it provides emotional healing for your elders. And finally, one-on-one mentorship focuses on quality, not quantity. Whether that's a benefit or a drawback is up to you. So, crucially, are there any unsuccess stories? And there aren't, as far as I'm aware. By all means, give me information saying where master-apprentice schemes have failed, because I'd be interested to know. So I'm going to give you another quick video from Cape Breton Island in Canada, and this is the Gaelic immersion program, master-apprentice program, sorry.
Archie calls her enough.
Oh, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. I just can't believe how, you know, she's teaching him the Gaelic. And oh, it just does me a world of good. It's like as if I'm thinking I'm going to live forever. Even when I go to bed at night, I lay on the pillow and I think of him. And I'm thinking of Rosie when she gets to the age where she can talk. You know, that's gonna be her first language, where she'll learn English too, but...
As you can see, emotional healing for the older person, also emotional healing for the younger person. And in that video goes on to say that she'd grown up disconnected from her culture, culturally disenfranchised, as Gillard says. You know, she didn't know if she was Scottish or Canadian. Obviously, like me, she's not Scottish. And reconnecting with the language allowed her to gain her cultural identity back. And she talks about how much she wants her kids, this is them by the way, Archie and Rosie, to grow up Gaelic speaking. Rosie's now 3.5 and Archie started year 2 this week. And I can confirm that they're both Gaelic native speakers. But one thing that interests me with Cape Breton Island is that they've taken the master-apprentice scheme and looked at how it can be applied in other ways. And this is a program called Ngadlu Kaurna, where the apprentices are teenagers and the masters are usually the people who are being apprenticed to the elders. Some kids in the Ngadlu Kaurna program speak Gaelic at home, but most of them don't. Some may have a Gaelic speaking grandparent. And this is an interesting, because it's taken the scheme and it's looked at it in another way and applied it in another way, and it's providing intergenerational continuity of language for these kids. But that brings me to why do some programs or methods work and why do some not? And looking at these three and what's worked and what hasn't and why it has or hasn't worked, I've come to the conclusion that for a revival program that's moving from one community to another to be successful, it needs to be flexible and it needs to be natural. Flexible because no two minority or endangered language communities are the same. You've got some that have thousands of speakers and some that have no speakers. You've got some that are in cities, some that are in countries, some that are on completely different continents. And, you know, they've all have different strengths and all have different situations. So the program needs to be flexible if it's going to suit all or even most or some of these contexts. And it also needs to be natural. It shouldn't need extensive training for the teacher. It should be fairly easy to implement using skills your people have and using places your people already have. And for example, bringing the grandmother into the language nest. Grandmothers don't need to be taught how to be grandmothers. They just know that. Old people do not need to be taught how to sit down and tell you every story they've ever heard in their lives. You know, they do that. And it needs to fit with and build on the community culture, which again is flexibility. You know, you don't want something that will jar, be completely against the culture of the community, but you also want something that will build up that culture. So, I'm sure I've gone over time. There may be time for some questions.
Thank you so much. We'll take two quick questions or feedback. Anyone?
It was very nice and concise. The check box there, I did a lot. But I reckon instead of asking one explicit question, I want to ask you a selfish thing. Do you have any good people to recommend or any more theory for that at all? Some part of the methodology?
I don't know of anything that's looked at all the methodologies broadly. If you're interested in any of the particular methodologies, especially like the master-apprentice scheme is the one I've had the most to do with. So I can probably send you some information about that. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Anyone else?
That's an acronym?
No, it's a Hebrew word meaning studio. But interestingly, it's been borrowed into both Welsh and Gaelic, just as is. So funnily enough, Ulpan is now a Gaelic word that basically means adult language class.
Anyone else? Thank you so much.